couldn't imagine that life will change so fast. And actually, when we were standing at Maidan, we couldn't imagine that a lot of events will happen in Ukraine. Annexation of Crimea, the war in the east, and it gave us the sense that we are responsible for the future of Ukraine. And I'm sure that Mustafa, Leshchenko, and other activists, journalists that went to politics, now they are not experienced enough in the politics. So we are learning by doing, and it's very important to succeed there, because the expectations of people for the change are so high. Yeah. So it depends on us, on our activity and principled position and professionalism to deliver these reforms in Ukraine. And also, if Ukraine succeeds, it means the whole region, post-Soviet region, will be changed. For me, the moment was when EU MP came to Ukraine and was criticizing us as a civil society representatives why we are not going to politics. Because we are afraid to take a shame of politics. And they insist that we will be more effective being MPs and working inside of the parliament that continue to criticize and developing the agendas. Plus, also when I saw that such people like Kivalov and others also...
In the former representative of Yanukovych party, who was the head of the election commission in 2004 and responsible for rigging the elections.
Yeah, so when I realized that all odious, all negative persons also run into the parliament, so this is our responsibility for the country, to go to the politics and change the approaches, providing new approaches and a new quality of politics. This is why we invited a lot of representatives from reanimation package of reforms, independent experts, to Samopomich party list, open this list for critics, for journalists, and in this way we were trying to deliver the new approaches before entering to the parliament. And for us it's very important now to be united, young generations, because Maidan helped a new generation of change makers and state builders to be shown to the society, and it's our responsibility for the changes, for leadership there, and professionalism.
We don't have a lot of people to change everything, but what is true is that those people who are now in the parliament from civil society, they're very strong in their positions, in their principles, and they're very young. And as I know, and as I hope, they're supported by civil society, by people outside the parliament. I think our power will be in that, that we will try to lobby those initiatives we had before outside the parliament. Now we are trying to fulfill them inside the parliament. The first and the second is that if we join, and I hope we join, not maybe today, not in 1 month or in 2 months, but definitely, eventually we will join. I mean, all those young people. And I think it will be a new page of Ukrainian policymakers, because those who are old, they will went. You know that they don't have enough time. They have maybe 1 year, 2 years. In 3 years, I hope, and I'm sure that those people who are now young in parliament, they will run this country. So we don't have chances to lose this chance. So I think that we still have ability to change traditions and to show that politicians can be different than people had before.
What we see now from the coalition agreement, from all the debates, those with money and power, they are really taking decisions. Well, what are your tools?
First point is that, yeah, you're right that there are not much more tools to influence policymakers inside the parliament than outside as a journalist, but this is our choice, and it's our responsibility. We had 2 options: to criticize this parliament and this government again, such we did just 10 years before that, or to do something ourselves. It will be hard. But the second point is that you told that those oligarchs, their influence system, yes, they still, but you can't change it immediately in 1 day. Someone should start that. And I hope that we are pioneers of this movement. We will try to make these policymakers and this institution of parliament much more transparent and accountable. Because now you know that a lot of people who are now in our parliament even don't know are they shareholders in which companies, and we don't know the conflict of interests of their MPs, and etc. First. The second is that I think we will try to change the law election law and election code. It is first point we should do, because
what do you want to change, or what needs to be done?
We want to change it. We want to do it with open list and a proportional system. This is very important thing, that we saw that even after Maidan, people are corrupted, and the election we had before even this election, they were not clear, and it was not fair and free. So
you want to get rid of the majority districts?
Yes.
Yes. So all proportional.
Yes.
Because maybe not everyone knows, Ukrainians have two votes. They vote once in their local constituency, and then they have a vote for party lists.
So 3 parts. But still, you know, this is very big mistake thinking that MPs, they're writing laws and it's only one role of. No, we are controlling. And this is other big role of parliament, to control government, to show all corruption systems, and etc. But what is very important, that in 1 year, I want to come here to this studio and to talk to you, and I don't want to betray those people who believe that the new generation can provide new approaches and new values to the parliament. Because now this is very, very responsible point. We can be as MPs. No one will ask some people from old generation that they are corrupted or they did something wrong, but they will ask us. So I want you don't have this question.
I think that the key element of the transformation for Ukraine is about not only deregulation, but the first is rule of law. The rule of law needs to prevail in the country, and it's comprised of 3 key reforms that needs to take place. One, it's anti-corruption, and there is a set of things that has to happen. Second, it's court reform, juridical reform, and we need to make sure that it's taking place. And the third one is the reform of the Ministry of Interior and everything related to this area. We need to bring the rule of law as #1. The second element is deregulation. Deregulation is critical for economic development, because deregulation is something that removes the obstacles for the businesses to flourish, investments to come, as well as remove a lot of areas where corruption is taking place.
But don't you fear that actually deregulation is the reason why a lot of analysts say it's oligarch regime, you know, in Ukraine thriving because of deregulation, because of lack of pursuing the law, because of lack of enthusiasm among Ukrainian government officials to pursue the law, and to actually a lot of lobby groups inside the previous parliament and a lot of previous parliaments, they were working on how to dismantle this complex structure of regulations that it dates back to the Soviet Union.
Well, you're absolutely right that over time, the regulation been built and piled and then regulated over the regulation. When we worked with the NGO Easy Business in Ukraine, they analyzed almost 800 different regulation acts. And when we went down and split it up, which can be done and should be implemented as soon as possible, it's 173. And then we start looking into what can be done with this. And there is a working group going on through one by one. And each regulation has something that has some corruption element, some hidden things, some unjustified regulation. And in order to minimize that, we have to, or not minimize, we need to eliminate that. We need to introduce certain laws and certain decrees of the Cabinet of Ministers. But in order to introduce the laws, we needed new Verkhovna Rada.
What is the President doing to ensure that the reform process doesn't turn into a clan-on-clan war?
Like it did before on many occasions.
First, transparency. Let me outline what we established. The President established National Reform Council. In National Reform Council, we have President, Prime Minister, members of the Parliament, National Bank of Ukraine, and whole Cabinet of Ministers sitting in the one board and making decision on the key reforms. Then under it, we established Executive Committee, which has 2 people from the President, 2 people from the Cabinet of Ministers, 2 people from the Parliament, and 1 person from National Bank. This is executive team which meets every week and tracks what's the process, how the process on each reform is taking place.
But how the opposition will be present
through Rada, through Verkhovna Rada, they can be nominated. We will be asking Rada to nominate people. What is the number one importance is that any working group, let's pick the civil service reform. This working group developed laws and some procedures, the latest law. They must, and we make sure that that happens, engage the civil society, expert. All their work needs to be public. So there is a public involvement and public ability to trace any reform on the site Reforms in UA, which we are currently trying to establish and build, so that any idea and any decision can be traceable, any development, any thoughts be there online, anything that's important for the country can be open to anybody in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. I think that, and I hope that political parties will find compromises on some of the topics for reforms, but they will still focus on the results that has to be delivered, because the country currently needs support. Country needs revival. Country needs action. And I hope that there will be no political jeopardy and personal positioning versus the country, which we all aspire to change, which we all aspire to prosper and join European Union, hopefully into 2020.
It's important to take the Russians seriously, to accept that they have a foreign policy doctrine, which they do, but also to accept that they're very good at confusing us about exactly what they're up to. Certainly their foreign policy is directed against Ukraine as a stable and successful state. What I think is less often noticed is that this is part of a broader policy aimed at destabilizing the European Union. Because Russia is technologically and demographically weak, the only way for Russia to become a great power is for the European Union and the transatlantic relationship to fall apart. The reason why they like to talk about the Americans is that talking about NATO, talking about the Americans, helps inside the European Union, because then the Europeans can say, aha, the Maidan, Ukraine, that's the Americans' fault, or that's the Americans' responsibility. But I think the conflict now, since 2013, in Russian foreign policy, the main concern has not really been NATO. The main concern has been the European Union.
But what is the European Union answer on that? Do they think they understand, and the different people in Paris, Berlin, and London have an idea about that?
Yeah, it's a terribly interesting moment, because Russian elites have come to a kind of clarity about what they want in the world. They want to have a competing vision of civilization. They want the European Union to be weaker, whereas European elites are living in a world that they themselves did not make. They're living in a world that they inherited from the previous generations, and they take so much for granted, like the European Union itself. The idea that the European Union could have an enemy, or that the European Union could fall apart, is very difficult for people to think, and yet it does have an enemy and it could fall apart.
Well, that seems interesting, because before this conflict, I mean, you're talking about how Russia saw the EU as, at the very least, a competitor and, you know, possibly a foe to be rivaled with. But it seems like one of the results of this conflict is that many European leaders and countries have started to see Russia in the role of a foe, where they hadn't seen that before. They'd focus more on opportunities to work together.
Right. I'm not saying this foreign policy has a big success. I'm saying that it is coherent and we have to take it seriously. I completely agree with you. The objective outcome of Russian foreign policy has been to accelerate a trend in which Russia becomes a junior partner of China. Right? If we look at this, if we look at the Maidan, the revolution, the counter-revolution, the war, from a global perspective, the very significant thing is that China is the winner. Right? China still has good relations with Ukraine. China is in a much stronger position vis-a-vis Russia. China has much more room for maneuver in general as the Americans fall back. So China is winning, and China is trying to be very quiet about winning. And Russia is trying to be very quiet about the fact that in losing the West, it's tilting its whole population towards China. If Putin had to say, the result of my foreign policy is that we're no longer going to be like the West, we're going to be more like China, that wouldn't be very popular. So he's trying very hard not to say that, but that's what's happening.
But when you say that Russia has a thought-out foreign policy, even if it's not successful, is there room in that policy and that understanding for Ukraine as it is? Is that something that can be negotiated with or not?
No, good question. No. Okay. There is not room for Ukraine as a stable state with a European orientation. For Russia's policy towards Ukraine to change, Russia's policy towards the European Union would have to change. That's what I mean when I say it's all one thing. Russian policy could change. I mean, I think it would be wise if it did. I think ultimately the future of Russia is with Europe or the West in some broad sense. That's where Russian trade goes. That's where Russian intellectual history comes from. That's where Russians like to travel. Despite, contemporary disagreements, that would be the natural orientation. And they could shift back that way. All I'm saying is that they can't really change policy towards Ukraine without changing the overall policy towards Europe. The reason why you have a conflict in Donetsk and Lugansk does have everything to do with Russian foreign policy. It's much easier to start conflicts than to stop them, and it's much easier to disintegrate a state than it is to create one. The only optimistic thing that one can really say, and here I echo the foreign minister's remarks, is that the horrible scale of destruction in Donetsk and Lugansk, precisely humanitarian disaster, means that decentralization is an opportunity, not to take power in Kiev and spread it around because there isn't that much power in Kiev, but to create institutions from the ground up. I think the two most important things in the Southeast are first to recognize on a world scale that there's an impending huge humanitarian catastrophe coming this winter, which Europe and the West will have to help with, and for the Ukrainian state to recognize that people in Lugansk and Donetsk are going to remember the last thing. Right now they think of the war, they think of their cities being shelled by the Ukrainian army, and that's totally natural they think of that. But if the Ukrainian state is able to rebuild, at least in the areas that it occupies or controls, that will be the next thing that they remember. And in that sense, decentralization and reconstruction are the only political opportunities.
Now, you had a book that came out. Do you deal with that story? Is that the narrative you present there?
The book is called Maidan?
Ukraine crisis, what it means for the West.
Ukraine crisis, what it means for the West. Oh,
scandalously cheap. €13.
Yeah, I bought it.
Well, it's about three things. Ukraine is the middle third, the kind of meat, really. But Ukraine crisis is kind of a misleading name because it's pejorative. As I said, answer to the first question, the original aim was to change things for the better. Plus, it's, Russia's crisis. Russia caused it. Russia's the aggressor. So the first third is about Russia and Russia's pathologies. And there's a good bit in there about the West as well and our relative failure to show proper solidarity with Ukraine and properly deter Russia.
So do you think the election is an attempt to break with the crisis and bring it back to progress and reform, or where in that narrative does the election fit?
Well, President Poroshenko used the kind of standard metaphor yesterday. The election should reboot the political system. So that's the aim. Maybe not completely, but,
a fresh start.
There'll be fresh faces.
Стой! Паша, стой!
Девчонку оставляйте здесь. Так, быстренько,
Юля,
быстренько, перебежечками.
Ребята готовятся к бою.
Ну, пішли, можете подивитися зі мною. От у нас позиції РПшників, боєприпаси. Продовжаємо далі. От пулеметчик у нас, товариш сидить. Естественно, все прикривається нашими мухами, РПГ, там воги працюють. От наша бойова машина. Скільки на горі бачила, скільки вона вже патронів отримала до себе. От вже постріляна, масло тече. Була постріляна вниз під морду з РПГ. От туди любителі перти сепари і от сюди. А обично обстрілюють от сюди. Весь бой зав'язується на цій стороні.
Вот это ребята воюют, я не знаю, кто еще так воюет, как они. Пацан вот зры. ГПшка себе. И на спине у него.
Граната рядом позорвав. Там повезло бронік осколки. Реально там осколки повитаскували, пошили його трохи. Ну він не хоче міняти його, каже, на трофейний. Так, реально бронік спас йому. Ви бачите, це все реально. Там би полетіла сонна артерія і броні, і каску ми вже викинули, каску розкололо. А, нашого кота бойового. Кстати, самий крутий котяра. Починаєш обстріл, він починає бігати по брустерам.
И контуженный.
Походу.
Назвал у него Атошка.
Атошка.
Атошка. Тоже контуженный. Как и вы все, да?
Слава Богу, пока не всі.
Ну что, побежали.
over the past week, the OSCE mission has been accused both by Ukrainians of being biased towards Russia, and then by the Russian Foreign Ministry, and then I think maybe even the Russian ambassador to the UN of being biased towards Ukraine. I mean, why is that? How has that mission gotten to a situation that both sides are insisting on that?
Well, this was a week where we felt quite deep in the hole, and sometimes you have to make light of what's happening. And someone joked the other day, if both sides are attacking you, well, maybe you're doing the right thing. But, it was a week where it was unprecedented in terms of the criticism, but also on social media, smear tactics, that sort of thing. I've never seen anything like this, quite frankly, and I've been at this job of being a spokesperson for quite some time. But I think what we found out is that we have to do a much better job at filling the information gap. Clearly, ordinary folks out there don't have the full understanding of the work that we do. And also, what we're going to be doing now is ramping up our contacts with civil society, spending more time outside of Kyiv, in the regions, talking directly to people there. Because I think what's happening too, remember we talked about this in Ottawa, was that there is a frustration, clearly a frustration at the lack of a durable, sustainable ceasefire. Some people have said the ceasefire is in name only, on paper only. So we're there in the middle. People see us, they read our reporting. We've also received quite a bit of criticism that our reporting isn't substantial enough. For example, we don't say direction from where shelling has come from, or we don't say who fired. So that's why we aim.
We have one tweet I just wanted to bring your attention to. If you look behind you, so this is Carl Bildt, and he's saying, obvious that Russian regular units are now going into Ukraine again. How will EU react? Minsk agreement totally disregarded by Kremlin. And just because you pointed out the fact, one of the big issues of the Minsk Protocol, the Minsk peace agreements, and this situation where, some people call it a farce. They're saying it's very critical, and I think some of the critical attitudes towards the OSCE are towards this agreement, where the OSCE is, very strongly attached to that.
So there are two things here. One is the agreement. It isn't holding very well. I can tell you that since it was signed, and remember that was way back in September, we haven't seen or we haven't been informed of one single pullback of heavy artillery. I must tell you, though, that in terms of this week, for the first time, I believe it was on Friday, we actually reported that our monitors saw camouflaged men in Luhansk with Russian Federation flags and other badges on their uniforms. Up until now, we haven't said that, because we're a mission that we only say what we actually see with our own eyes. Verification is very, very difficult. Also, this week was very significant in the sense that on 3 separate occasions, our monitors documented the movement from the east towards Donetsk, unmarked military convoys, about 127 vehicles in all, and quite a few of them pulling not light artillery. This was 120 millimeter howitzer artillery and also multiple launch rocket systems. So think of it this way: eyes and ears of the international community on the ground. We report, and then that information goes to others who it's their job to take action or draw conclusions. But we have to maintain our neutrality in order to stay put.
But there were, Ian may bring, there were some information by the journalists like Simon Ostrovsky, who worked there, and more or less what he stated, that that recent convoys of armed troops in Donbass were deliberately displayed for the OSCE and reporters to see that they don't hide that. What will you tell on that? That it's so obvious.
How we conclude deliberately, I don't know, but all I can tell you is that we reported 3 times that we were seeing how many vehicles, no license plates. The guys inside didn't have signs on them either. So, there's a lot of disinformation out there. There's a lot of trickery going on.
Well, there is this, what was it, the ABSE, that this group that was monitoring, far right-wing European politicians who came, and the day before they had the elections in the separatist-controlled East, they created this new organization.
Which the ASE.
Right, so very closely, and then I believe it was RIA Novus even reported that the OSCE was observing there, which they weren't.
No, we weren't. And then the other thing about this JCCC, the Joint Coordination Control Center in Debaltseve, so what that is, I call it a formation, if you even want to find a word for it, but it includes general staff from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, general staff from the Russian Ministry of Defense. We're not a part of the JCCC, but we've been so connected to it on social media and reporting, I think sloppy reporting. We're there to observe, to say what they're doing and what they're telling us, but we're not a part of that.
Was there the case then one of this GCCC mission of the use some kind of the OSCE insignia?
Yeah, and that's intolerable. We've told them so. We've told them not to do it, and we will not tolerate that type of behavior, because that's taking our branding and using it. And you know what? At the end of the day, that poses a security risk for us, because I've now heard stories of also Ukrainian military or volunteers saying that they don't like this JCCC because they ridicule them and this sort of thing. So we have to maintain our neutrality from bodies like that.
Somehow the OSCE present there let a lot of people believe that there is a monitoring going on, but we understand it's a huge territory, and we should can you explain, you know, there are about 100, you know, you have around 200, more than 250 people in the mission, but just 100 on the ground. You know, how are the places, what are the places you can reach? You know, how can you really monitor the situation in such a large area? Can you reach the Russian border, which is the Ukrainian-Russian border, which probably the biggest source of the weapon coming, and the whole Minsk agreement is about to, you know, controlling that border. Are you able? What OSCE is able to do?
So the mandate, we're resourced for up to 500 monitors, and we're trying to get to that number as soon as possible. All new monitors that come into the mission, or I should say most of them, will be deployed to the eastern part of the country. Secondly is that one of the main constraints we have is the lack of armored vehicles. We cannot send unarmed civilians to eastern Ukraine without armored vehicles. So we're in need of about well over 100 more armored vehicles. And just the other day, President Poroshenko, on behalf of the Ukrainian government, handed over 10 armored vehicles for our mission. So that's going to be a big help. But that's a big constraint. And also the amount of territory we have to cover. It's about half the size of Switzerland, the conflict zone. And then also those checkpoints, shelling. Oftentimes we go to somewhere where we're told there's something happening, shelling starts, we have to retreat. I could go on and on about the constraints.
What are the security or safety protocols for the OSCE? If you have an area that, for example, is shelled, and that's something the OSCE observers want to go and take a look at, how long do they have to wait before they can go, or what are the restrictions on that?
Well, sometimes it's very easy to get to, other times it's impossible to get to, and we did have an incident a few weeks ago where we were checking something out, and then our convoy came out of under shelling, and one vehicle, an armored vehicle with a strong things, totally destroyed. Also remember, we do have some no-go areas. This is primarily in southern Luhansk, where the guys who call themselves Cossacks are in control there. You'll recall a few months ago we had 8 colleagues kidnapped. They kept for a month, and 4 of them in Gumenyuk entirely. So we're being extra careful now. Every day we do new security assessments, and then we decide whether we can go. Or there are some days where the guys stay in their hotels or in their residences because it's too unsafe to go out. Having said all that, we do assume risk, a certain degree of risk. We're prepared, and it's very, very dangerous circumstances in many places.
There are Russians in this mission. We know that it's more or less allowed for a country, if the country sends their monitors, it is not illegal, it's there. But we have these 18 people, what I understand, 18 Russian citizens. And who decides who goes? Because what is the other concern? There are Russian citizens, there shouldn't be more than 10% of the team.
That's correct.
But there are other people from countries like, you know, which believe to have some pro-Russian sentiment, like Serbia or Bulgaria or post-Soviet states, and there is a belief that people can be controlled because they are Russian speakers. There is a full post-Soviet space of, you know, people who can participate in the mission. Who decide how it works?
So,
how you ensure
you're right. I mean, you almost answered your own question, is that participating states are all entitled to nominate, they use the word second, monitors to our mission. There's a ceiling, a cap of 10% per country. And out of almost 300 now, we have 18 citizens of the Russian Federation. They were proposed by the Russian Federation. And also, I should say that, I mean, in my case, I was nominated by Canada, and that's because of the experience I had. I speak more or less pretty good Ukrainian, some Russian, so these are all skills that we need. When when you come in, when you're absorbed into the mission, you get special training, but you also sign a code of conduct that has very strict rules on what you can and cannot do. And one of those is you cannot share information with a third party. Now, I know people are going to say, well, that's meaningless. It's only a piece of paper. But, you know, we work in teams, together in teams. No one works individually, so there's no freelancing or anything like that going on. So you are, you are monitored quite carefully. These criticisms will continue, and it's the first time I've heard that there are nationals from other countries too that could be, criticized or vulnerable. But this is the nature of this beast, if you will, of this organization, 57 participating states, of which Russia is a member.
But there's some interesting issues there because there are no Ukrainian observers, correct? Because it's a conflict within Ukraine.
You'll find that in other missions, whether it's in Kosovo or elsewhere, that's just the way the OSCE has its staffing rules, is nationals from the country do not work as monitors. However, we have employed well over 100, and there's more to come, Ukrainian nationals, and these are people might say, oh, they're just office staff, but they're not. There are a lot of experts in there too that are contributing.
Наша задача одна, то есть доставлять останки погибших солдат украинцев домой. Волонтеры все гражданские. Как правило, это большая часть поисковой группы, которая давно уже работает по поисковой деятельности, организовывает вахты памяти по Великой Отечественной войне, а также по Первой мировой войне. То есть это авторитетные поисковики. Мы идем под сопровождением по зеленому коридору, как говорится, и, соответственно, по четко отработанной информации приезжаем на место, собираем тела и возвращаем их домой. Конкретно по украинской стороне этим занимается Союз народной памяти и музей Збройных сил Украины. Все банально просто, то есть не надо ничего придумывать. Встали, собрались, проверили технику, комплектацию, дождались, как говорится, добро получили и начинаем движение. Соответственно, добрались до места, по ситуации изучили, что там, как там, подобрали тела и дорога домой.
Хочу пожелать всем в первую очередь идти по своему сердцу, а не по эмоциям, которые нам навязывают.
Что за дела? Кто меня слил?
Идти работать, то есть сколько там, да, сколько сможете, столько и будете по земле.
Да, пока позволяет ситуация, пока есть возможность, мы будем делать свое дело до конца. Все, удачи вам.
Very big quantity of young people, and not only young, who escaped. It was here some figures that Donetsk has 750,000, 100,000 people, but I can say it's no way. It's 1,000 and 1,000 people left Donetsk, and I can tell you with a big responsibility. We have a practice, and once per month we meet with the people who left Donetsk. So it's a big quantity of people, mainly young people, who has no will to stay in the place where the gangs, where the criminality, where there is no future. So I can say all of these people left Donetsk, and it's a big humanitarian catastrophe. The main question: there is no infrastructure of support. No infrastructure. We need this, we need that, but we don't work on infrastructure. So in this case, I just want to say that this year, the Pritzker Architectural Prize 2014, the most important architectural prize in the world, got Japanese architect Shigeru Ben for his disaster architecture, for his works which he does in Africa, in zone of disaster, how they organize places for living for people in disaster. I think Ukraine and places we have so many abundant industrial places. Let's do something where we can take people with a big quantity, use possibility of infrastructure, because we cannot go one by one, paper by paper. It's very difficult.
Я пользуюсь программой только фотошопом и очень хочу сжать его использование, чем меньше, тем лучше. Процесс строится по-разному. Например, это совсем цифровая картинка. То есть тут нет никакого аналога. А вот здесь есть пластилин. Вот эти штучки слеплены из пластилина. Обычно я делаю что-то вроде цветового скетча, то есть не линейный скетч, не как карандашиком. А делаю в мониторе скетч из цветов, понимаю, как примерно будет выглядеть эта картинка, и думаю, ага, вот здесь я могу эту часть нарисовать руками, отсканировать ее, положить сверху и обрезать, как мне нужно. Иногда получаются картинки там, где больше бумажной работы, иногда где меньше. Но обычно это что-то, там, я рисую какую-то деталь и вырезаю ее ножницами, сканирую и вкрапляю, или это полностью цифра. Это подол с замерзшими руками рисовал контрактовую площадь, у меня уже ручка вот так была, я там ждал кого-то. Ну да, контрактовый набросок, я так формирую идею, а наброски я делаю отдельно. То есть я хотел сделать что-то каноническое, почти иконописное, то есть сделать шахтеров, но там примерно там дать даже какие-то намеки на нимбы. Ну, в смысле, что они мученики, они попали в заложники вот этой ситуации. Я знаю своего дядю, например, дядя шахтер, там у него 40 лет стаж подземный, у него абсолютно проукраинская позиция. И вот он в заложниках, у него нет денег, чтобы уехать из Донецка, ну там он в Дмитрове живет. Дмитров это рядом с Красноармейском. Это сейчас украинская территория, а была спорная, там гуляли, стреляли, там тоже вот. И он оказался заложником этой ситуации, там все он порывался взять автомат в руки и пойти там к украинским войскам. Ну, конечно, его там моя тетя никуда не пустила, он в возрасте там 70 лет, какой автомат может быть. Пытался сделать из своего скетчбука что-то приличное и рисовать углем. Ну что, это разве красиво? Пока оно нарисовано углем, это красиво, а потом, когда страница закрылась, что это получается из этого? Я из Донецка приехал там, почти 10 лет назад, 9, в Киев, работать дизайнером, потому что я в Донецке уже переработал во всех местах, в которых мог работать. И из последней конторы там, я уходил с угрозами директора, что они меня найдут и рассчитают в порошок, если еще раз здесь появлюсь. Просто чтобы не платить зарплату. Так было, да. Бабушка с дедушкой живут в Донецке, мы с ними об этом не говорим, потому что я знаю, что там, дедушка там, по модулю 0, а бабушка, к сожалению, бабушка много смотрит телевизор. Они в августе уехали, уже в последнее время, куда можно было вырваться, они очень проукраински меня настроены. Там находиться невозможно, смотреть на соседей, там, в парадном. Здесь наплыв такой хороший произошел из Восточной Украины жителей. И, к сожалению, большинство либо там, с нулевой оценкой, наверное, большинство с нулевой оценкой там, в отношении происходящего, ну, в смысле по модулю 0. А есть еще и такие, которые по модулю там, с минусом сюда приехали. Ну, вот. И хотя, несмотря на то, что мои родители имеют совсем другой модуль, но отождествление все равно это происходит. То есть они себя все равно отождествляют с беженцами там, с Востока Украины. Им не просто было находиться, потому что есть такое странное, наверное, какое-то ощущение неполноценности, что ли. И вот они уехали там, в другую страну, при том, что жить там дешевле, чем в Киеве, там, в 1,5 раза. У кого уже и сейчас позиция там, созвучная с моей позицией, тому это нравится. А у того, у кого позиция другая, там, тот это быстрее закроет и перелистнет. То есть, мне кажется, такими картинками я там или кто-то еще можно только увеличивать что? Боже, я как Царев сказал, увеличивать что? Увеличивать что? Ну, наверное, градус накала либо позитивный, либо негативный там, в отношении того, что происходит. Заставить кого-то передумать картинками, ну, очень вряд ли, наверное.
Kremlin propaganda isn't designed necessarily to make people believe, you know, these ludicrous theories and counter-explanations or whatnot. It is designed to distract them. It is designed to misdirect. So, you know, again, what happens? Articles that would normally be filed about, you know, just how much of a pariah Putin has become, you know, the fact that that Canada's prime minister sort of, you know, said, "I'll shake your hand, but I want you to get out of Ukraine first." I mean, all of these stories, which tend to aggregate and cast this perception of Russia as a country alone, or a country because of its aggressive posture that has become, you know, pariah unto nations. That gets drowned out the minute something like, ooh, new satellite footage showing this terrorist attack, you know, the way it happened is not how you've been led to believe. The problem with it is the production of it was so amateurish, it was so farcical. I mean, you know, Google image search debunked that claim within 30 seconds. that it strikes me as a kind of a mode of desperation or an act of desperation. I think the Kremlin is sort of casting about and doing everything and anything in its power to change the conversation or change.
But to play. But to play devil's advocate a little bit here, which is maybe also a favorite card of some Russian media, though not only them. I mean, this idea of using propaganda, that's not unique to Russia. What is it that Russia does that really makes it different, or the way that it does it, I suppose?
Well, I think, their clever trick, if you like, is they understand that the Western media is duty-bound to report, quote, both sides of the story, right? I mean, there's a transparency and openness to the Western news cycle that there is not to the Russian news cycle, particularly now that independent media voices are being, completely eclipsed or silenced. So what I would say that Putin is very adept at doing is he seconds organizations like the BBC or the New York Times or the Washington Post, makes them unwitting and unwilling accomplices in the dissemination of misinformation. To give you one example that I like, when the chemical weapons attack in Syria was perpetrated in August of 2013, Alexander Lukashevich, the spokesman for the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Russia, said, "Oh, well, we can prove instantly that this whole thing was a hoax, or it was, staged for, by the rebels to try and draw Western intervention." And his evidence was the first YouTube video showing the alleged victims of this chemical attack had been uploaded before the attack itself. Now, what he didn't realize is YouTube runs on California time, not Damascus time. So the real story there is the Russian Foreign Ministry doesn't know that the Earth moves around the sun in daily fashion, except that this actually was picked up by the mainstream media and sort of put out there as, Russian Foreign Ministry says Ghouta attack staged. So the problem I have, or one of the sort of recommendations we put forward in the report is media can be a little more disciplined. It can exercise a little more restraint or better judgment in understanding that, look, you are, to the Kremlin, a dupe, a useful idiot, or a patsy. I mean, you are being used to put stuff out there and to kind of sow skepticism or doubt, or to inject some conspiracy.
So what do you do? I mean, is it a question of the media becoming more active and having more agency as opposed to just being fed things? Or what do they do? Because the point that you make is that these ideas of freedom of the press and being unbiased, that these have been abused and taken advantage of specifically by Russian state media for the purposes of propaganda and the interests of the state. So what needs to be built up to fight that?
Well, I think, ending a little bit of journalistic laziness when it comes to reporting on these issues, that can go a long way. And look, this is not to cast aspersions at some of the excellent reporting that's been done on Ukraine by Western journalists. I mean, I can name several off the top of my head who I think are just absolutely stellar in the field. But the problem is, as you well know, a reporter who reports, in Ukraine from, the Donbass or whatever, it doesn't end with him, right? He files his piece or she files her piece, then it goes through a series of sort of editorial cleansings or rejiggerings. It winds up in the hands of a sub-editor who comes up with the headline and the stand first of the article. Look, just yesterday, and I tweeted this, I said this is a perfect case in point. CBS News had a headline that says, Russia claims new satellite footage shows who downed MH17. This was a full day after that supposed counterclaim or that new narrative of how MH17 was down had been completely debunked and embarrassed, including by the guy who, this sort of MIT graduate who submitted this evidence to the Russian Foreign Ministry. So the whole story had fallen apart, and here you are. I mean, you have to understand, a general audience, whether in the West or anywhere, they see headlines, they see subheads. There is a psychological effect that these things have, right? Not everybody gets through an entire news story. The concept burying the lead. The thing that should actually be the real big story so often winds up in the second to last paragraph of a news clipping. So when, if media sort of begins to understand that, look, we are being enlisted in this kind of campaign, we don't like it because it embarrasses our professionalism, right? It serves the interests of a government when we're not supposed to be serving the interests of any government. A little bit of more discipline, a little more rigor and methodological soundness can go a long way. Let's be very candid here. I work in journalism, you work in journalism. We deal with sources all the time. And one of the difficulties of our trade is knowing who to trust, right? Sometimes people spin you, sometimes they lie to you. But if you have a source and all that person does to you is lie and dissimulate and embarrass you, right? All that person is giving you is stuff designed to serve his or her agenda. Eventually that person ceases to be a source, or if you have to quote or cite them, you do so in a way that makes it clear that this is not a...
And that brings me to another point, though. I mean, what is the issue of money here? Because part of what you're talking about, people not putting the right diligence in and, you know, doing things that are quick, taking quotes that are there through wires as opposed to speaking to them themselves. It's the issue that, you know, you have fewer people working for news agencies, you have fewer bureaus in country, and this comes at the same time when you've seen that the Kremlin is willing to increase funding to state media outlets, so to RT, to open up new outlets, to rebrand Sputnik. I mean, that must be a factor there as well.
Oh, it's a huge factor. I mean, RT's budget is, I believe, $300 million, set to increase by 40% in the next year. I mean, this is the thing, right? You know, in the 70s and 80s, during the Cold War, the KGB had this tactic or this form of tradecraft known as active measures. The idea was to plant bits of disinformation in the West with the hope of weakening or dividing or vitiating the West's response to Soviet aggression. What we argue is, look, whereas 20, 30, 40 years ago, active measures were actually quite difficult to perpetrate. A famous example of this is the CIA invented the AIDS virus, right? That was a KGB concoction. Or better yet, the CIA assassinated John F. Kennedy. Also a KGB concoction planted in an Italian newspaper, which actually worked its way back to the Dallas prosecutor's office, and in more recent pop cultural memory was included in Oliver Stone's rather feverish motion picture JFK. These things take time, or they used to take time. They used to take a lot of resources. Today, active measures have been completely mediated. With RT, you don't even have to go out and find somebody who you can trust, who you can cultivate. Because, you know, the internet has kind of opened this landscape of a kind of, you know, sort of, you know, a fever dream of conspiracy theorists and cranks and lunatics, guys sitting in their parents' basement who think the US took down the World Trade Center, who believe the Pope is a reptilian, you know, space alien, and all these kind of crazy things. You pay them $50, they write an article in 15 minutes, probably less given the quality of the stuff, and they click publish. And once they click publish, people start to read it. And by the way, people who read it don't necessarily buy it. I would hope they don't in the case of, say, the Pope is a reptilian space alien. But, you know, it's clickbait, right? I mean, in new media terms, this is clickbait.
When it's the speed and it's the way of approaching it that's changed, and it's that whole relativity of truth and what do you consume.
An exact analog to the sort of CIA-invented AIDS active measure, and that is the CIA invented the Ebola virus as a form of biological weaponry. This was published on RT's Spanish-language news service, right? And if we're being a little cynical here, we would say the idea is to have audiences in Latin America, particularly the Chavista countries, pick this up because they're already inclined to anti-Western conspiracies, or they believe the CIA is sort of the most nefarious agency on the planet. And they'll take this at face value. All they'll say...
Well, they use it for their own purposes. Yeah, no, and I mean, I think this is the point that you've made so well in the report, partially that the media landscape is shifting and people don't quite know how to adjust to it. They don't have the media antibodies to process it all and to kind of separate the good from the bad, or at least from what's based on actual reporting from what's not. Because there seems to be two extremes to the argument often. They're the people that say it's all Russian propaganda, this is made up. They call anyone who's a Ukrainian speaker and a nationalist a neo-Nazi. And there's the other end, well, if we don't go all the way, but it's saying that at the very least the Ukrainian government turns a blind eye to some of it, that wants to use these people, especially from far-right battalions like Azov, for their own purposes. Where is the threat? How do you look at that?
Well, there is certainly a threat, but it's overblown. It's often seen as a principal issue in post-Euromaidan Ukraine, which is certainly not true. There are a whole number of other things that are more important, but still, I think it is a problematic issue for a whole number of reasons, because the recent rises of a few neo-Nazis into state structures, the election of a couple of them in the Verkhovna Rada is bad for Ukraine, because these people who have more recently risen are actually biological racists. But these actually people from the Social National Assembly, Patriot of Ukraine, they openly speak of biological racists, and this is indeed going back to Nazi ideology. That is not just a far-right ideology. It is far-right, but this is a very specific kind of far-right extremism, namely neo-Nazism. These are a few people. We are talking now about 3, 4, 5 people who have gone into parliament or into the administration. So it's not a big threat, but still it looks very dubious that people like that are promoted. And it's very bad for Ukraine's image abroad, because the Russian propaganda will certainly make use of it.
Ми запрошуємо наших почесних гостей приєднуватися до киян, до всіх гостей нашої столиці.
Нас несе